At this point in the program, I'd like to welcome Margie Graves. And I think many of you are familiar with that name. Margie is a very prominent figure in the federal IT community, and she's going to be moderating our first panel today. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Margie for a couple years. You may recall she was most recently the Deputy Federal CIO until her retirement from government service last December. And she spent a number of years at the Department of Homeland Security, where she was the Deputy CIO. And in the early years of the agency, she worked tirelessly to help unify the IT architecture of 22 separate legacy agencies. So Margie, it's always great to see you. Welcome.
Hi, Megan. It's a pleasure to see you also, and welcome to all our participants this afternoon. I'll be moderating the conversation that we'll be having with our panel, but first I wanted to start with a couple of teaser questions that will kind of lay the groundwork for the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon. And you as participants, please participate in the polling questions. The first one is, how do you define a hybrid cloud environment? A is at least one private cloud and at least one public cloud. B is 2 or more private clouds. C is 2 or more public clouds. D is all of the above. And E is it depends on who you ask.
I'm sure, Margie, you have some strong opinions on this question.
Yes. I think you've seen over the years that even though we defined cloud through NIST at one point, we actually have conversations out in the universe now that still don't exactly sync with that definition, and many people think it means different things. So I'm interested to see what the poll says.
So I'll give you guys about maybe 10 more seconds for attendees to respond, and then we're going to pull up the results. And we have our behind the scenes tech operator working tirelessly to produce this event. So appreciate all that she's doing. All right, let's see if we have those results. Oh, interesting.
So at least one private cloud and one public cloud. That's great, because that means you're dealing between your on-prem, more highly secure environment and a public cloud where you have partners, probably with multiple vendors at any given time, especially for the larger agencies.
Sure. And I think we've got one more polling question to tee up before we get started with your second panel here. And
yes, what issues would you most like to learn about or hear about today as it relates to hybrid cloud? A is how cloud fits into an organization's IT modernization strategy. B, how cloud enables the adoption of emerging technologies such as AI and machine learning. C, security risk in this type of environment. And D, challenges in migrating apps and other functions to the cloud.
And those are all really important issue areas, and I think we're going to touch on all of them today throughout the event, but curious to hear from our audience what they're most interested in. So maybe we'll give you guys about 5 more seconds to respond to the poll, and then we're going to see the results. Okay, interesting.
So it's a pretty close tie between security risk and challenges of actually migrating, particularly applications. And we found that in our discussions with federal agencies that taking legacy apps to the cloud requires a lot of prep and a lot of understanding of your architecture and your data before you can successfully do that. So that is not surprising to me at all. And the security risk, of course, we're going to have a second panel because this is such a hot topic, and you heard Grant speak about it earlier. It's such a hot topic, especially in the environment we're operating in today, that we're going to see a lot of discussion regarding security in these environments in the next panel.
Great. Well, with that, Margie, I think I'm going to turn you over to the first panel, and we look forward to that. And I think all of your panelists are here, which is great news.
That's always a good start. Thank you, Megan.
Sure.
So with me today, I have Mr. Dan Jacobs, who's the lead for cloud adoption and IT modernization centers of excellence at GSA. And Dan has over 20 years of combined IT and cybersecurity experience at GSA and the COE that he supports. He supports modernization activities through adoption of enterprise-wide security processes and technologies. So he's concentrating on the cyber side right now. And I worked with him also because he was a leader on many CIO Council initiatives, including Zero Trust Networking and the development of the CISO Handbook. So welcome, Dan.
Hi, Margie.
Mr. Brian Merrick, who's the Director of Cloud Program Management at the Bureau of Information Resource Management at the Department of State. Boy, that's a mouthful. Brian began his career, though, as a commissioned Army officer and then worked for Price Waterhouse in the private sector before moving to the State Department. And he joined the Bureau of Information Resource Management and then has held roles in both finance and technology. In his current role, he's leader for adopting cloud technologies. Ms. Mahtab Emdadi, who's the Regional Sales Director for Federal at Dell Technologies. She's a federal business leader who delivers mission-critical solutions to and emerging technologies to Homeland Security components. So she works a lot with my old agency, DHS, and she was also named a FCW Rising Star in 2019. Welcome. Mr. Mark Johnson, who's Group Vice President for Design Wins at Oracle North American Public Sector. And Mark was also an officer in the military for the Navy with 21 years before joining Oracle. And he was actually a fighter squadron leader. So a big risk taker there, aren't you, Mark? Right? And he's also an evangelist for hybrid cloud environments and using IT automation to secure and manage multi-cloud environments. So we'll talk a little about cloud orchestration today. So the first question is for you, Dan. In your role at GSA, you've had a front row seat to the adoption of hybrid cloud environments, and you've seen it across the federal government, multi-agency. How have you seen the adoption progress over the last few years? And more importantly, what's facilitated that adoption?
Oh, thanks, Margie. It's a big question, so you'll forgive me if I move a little fast. So it's no secret that cloud adoption across the federal sector has seen year-over-year double-digit percentage growth over the last decade, and it's expected to hit somewhere in the area of 10 billion annually in just the next couple of years. So it's clear that the adoption is happening at a rapid pace, but I think it's due to three primary factors, right? So one of them is it's easier than ever to buy cloud. Most, and I dare say every major PaaS, SaaS, and IaaS vendor have clouds specifically for the federal government use, and they're all on GSA schedules. GSA and other acquisition centers are constantly adapting to the changing acquisition landscape, ensuring that agencies and ultimately taxpayers receive the best value for their dollar. Not to toot GSA's or my own horn here, but consider things like GSA paving the way for consumption-based cloud acquisition. These types of terminology weren't even thought of 3, 4, 5 years ago. We have market research as a service. There's cloud migration templates and PWSs that are freely available for download, enterprise infrastructure solutions. All of these things make it easier, faster, and cheaper to buy cloud. As an example, GSA, a little known secret, GSA are our own customers. So we, as the Centers of Excellence, we get no preferential treatment. We're treated just like anyone else who buys. And my team just accomplished a buy that took 57 days from acquisition kickoff to contractor boots on the ground. That's not exactly Amazon Marketplace easy, but it's certainly easier than, say, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. The second thing is standardization has made it easier than ever to make risk-based determinations for cloud services. So I have a little bit of a cyber background myself. ATOs have always been one of the biggest hurdles to cloud adoption, right? But now we have things like FedRAMP, which help you normalize the compliance landscape. And most recently, the FedRAMP Tailored, the low impact SaaS, which allows rapid adoption of solutions that are low risk and low cost for organizations. And shout out to my friend Ashley Mahan and her team at GSA. Another thing is we have the TIC 3.0 reference architecture, which allows agencies to rapidly secure and scale, at scale, cloud-based applications. And shout out to Chris Connolly and his team at CISA for their thankless work. Those great folks making great things happen. And we also have strong governance, which makes ATOs even faster. Consider things like OMB A130, which establishes ATO reciprocity, or, hey, let's share all the hard work we're doing. It's a novel concept. Other organizations could use our hard work, right? NIST 837, which talks about ongoing authorizations, also known as continuous ATO, or, hey, we built this thing, we know exactly what's in it, we can update it automatically. What do you say we stop wasting time trying to ensure that it's secure when we know it is and we built it? The cybersecurity framework, which standardizes our approach to addressing cyber risk, and the list goes on and on. So because of these and probably a dozen other great security initiatives, risk determinations are becoming less of a let's figure out how to do something and more of a let's simply use what's already been done. And lastly, speaking of governance, I think Mr. Snyder talked about this a little bit. Clear governance and other cross-government drivers make cloud adoption an easy choice. So things like Cloud Smart that Grant talked about, defines how we see cloud, addresses security, procurement, and most importantly, the workforce management. And shout out to my great friends at the NIST NICE working group. Consider application rationalization playbook, right? 6 steps for IT portfolio managers, helps agencies make hard decisions of what to keep when they're moving, right? It's almost like moving your home. What do I keep and what do I toss? Data center optimization, huge, unbelievable amounts of savings has come from data center optimization. Acquisition reform, some of the things I talked about a little bit earlier. And I think of great importance are also my friends at OMB who, as Mr. Snyder said in his keynote, try to dance a delicate balance of policy focus between specific actions and intended goals. So take, for instance, M1926, updating TIC. It expressly says in the intent that it's to remove barriers. I mean, that verbiage actually exists in the memo. So this leads the way to the reference architecture, which is kind of the embodiment of removing barriers to cloud adoption. So the list goes on and on governance too, but if you look at it in the totality, what it really begins to do is paint a picture of how much of a role strong governance plays in this space. And that's probably my time.
Thanks very much, Dan. And I think it's really a testament to all the hard work that's gone on across the federal government, including working with all the agencies and getting their input on where their pain points were and understanding which policies we needed to change, how rapidly we needed to change, and which ones we needed to do first in order to prevent some of those blocks from getting people to the cloud. So I really appreciate your conversation with us today. And I'm going to turn to Brian. And Brian, the State Department has a global and far-flung mission and has operations around the world. And in your role, you're embracing the cloud technologies to deliver on that mission. And can you tell us a little bit about the State Department's journey and what are some real life examples of where hybrid cloud environments have fit into that journey and how was the mission impact?
Sure. So, as you can imagine, being a geographically separated organization, we have 275 posts all around the world, 47 different main mission areas. So we have a multitude of functions, security, data classification levels, different types of needs all around the world. So, what really happened is the business drove the priorities based on their mission. And cloud came into play, especially for those programmatic areas that really need to take advantage of real-time processing, direct collaboration with our partners overseas, things that they needed to do that they couldn't go through their traditional networking processes. So prioritizing our resources and our efforts in terms of supporting adoption and movement to the cloud for those business areas that have the most impact. For instance, we're seeing a huge move in terms of data capture, especially around these COVID-related responses and issues. All over the world, we very legacy approach to that in terms of emailing questionnaires and full text responses, which you can imagine trying to collate that across multiple layers of organizations, which is just a mind-numbing amount of manual labor. And so we were able to leverage some SaaS tools to actually automate those data requests and those data calls, work with business partners across the agency to make sure that we knew who needed access and the approval processes for releasing that information. We were able to connect that application to our master reference data table so we could ensure we had good, clean data at point of entry. across the entire enterprise. And so what that's done is actually led to a whole relook at how we incorporate best practices into decision support processes and how we really look at data as an asset. And we're also able to connect back into a lot of our on-prem data elements and connect that with some of the other survey data and new data captures we're getting around the world. And as you can imagine, an environment where we really can't access our network the way we used to, sitting at our desk, our desktop, going through the traditional processes. People need to be able to jump on their iPhone in an airport and report how many people just got on a plane, so they can figure out the repatriation logistics process on the back end back here. And so by using cloud technology, rendered for mobile accessibility, with single sign-on through cloud-based authentication and role-based access tools and processes, we've really been able to secure the environment and enable our users to access the tools they need to provide the information for the decision makers at the right time to make the calls they needed to. And that's something that I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. And so in our respect, we're trying to stay tightly aligned with the business priorities across the agency, find those pieces where it benefits the most from modernization, and really trying to surge on all the enabling pieces in terms of contracting, cloud platforms, single sign-on tools, and whatnot, so that we can assist in bringing those solutions to the forefront.
Oh, thank you, Brian. I think that sounds like it's an incredible journey, and mostly I'm hearing that you're taking some of the higher transaction volume business processes that you have in the State Department, and you're taking those first to the modern technologies, which will completely deliver and give the impact to the agency that it's needed, and while at the same time staying secure. And so I want to move to Mahtab and Mark. You both work with multiple clients across the federal government, and how has the conversation with your clients changed? And what unique things are governments doing with cloud? And what's the best advice and counsel that you give your clients today? Mahtab, we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. The conversations have started to change, and a big thank you for getting that Cloud Smart policy out. It's really been a game changer for us. So we're seeing the most savvy CIOs and CTOs realizing that cloud is not a place, it's an operating model. And they're really driving their teams to create and execute a strategy for multi-cloud environments for their agency. So we're excited about that. I think that we do need to continue to drive the message. I think a lot of the vernacular needs to change. Oftentimes I hear customers talk about on-prem. On-prem isn't always a private cloud. And I think that we need to start to make sure that when we say on-prem, if what we really mean is a private cloud, that we use the right terminology. But we're very encouraged. Some unique things that we're experiencing that customers are using with cloud have been, even with recent events with COVID-19. Customers are getting very smart about when and how to use public and private clouds. So COVID was something that no one was expecting. And I think we were faced with the challenge of rapidly scaling out virtual desktop environments for a lot of our customers. And we work with many of them to stand up VDI environments in AWS on the VMware Cloud in AWS. And it was very fast. And that's what they needed. They needed something fast. And they thought it was something that was going to be mostly temporary, that they could shut down after a period of time. And now that we're realizing that this remote work thing is probably going to stick around even after COVID, we're more in a phase 2 of do it right. And since that workload has now become a persistent workload, customers are realizing that the best TCO for persistent workloads are private clouds. So they're repatriating those VDI environments back to their Dell private clouds. So it's exciting to see customers get smarter about workload placement. And my advice would be that no matter what you're doing with your different clouds, just don't lock yourself into any proprietary technology unless it's very unique and differentiated and only something that a single cloud provider can do. For example, I wouldn't recommend any customer leverage PaaS solutions that are provided by, cloud vendors. I would tell you that those are strategically there to lock your applications into their cloud. I would say instead, invest in agnostic PaaS and container solutions such as Pivotal Cloud Foundry or VMware Tanzu that you can really layer on any cloud that you want. And not only future-proofs that workload to be mobile, but it provides your organization flexibility and mobility. On the flip side, if there's something that only one cloud provider can do, such as O365, by all means, go all in. It's a great idea, and again, it's very unique to them. I think my favorite quote to just remember, and I always tell customers, is just leverage the innovation and not the technology.
I do agree that I don't think we're ever going to go back to the way it was before in an office environment or the way that we work in general. You see it happening in commercial areas. You see it happening in conversations with the federal government as we're talking about bringing people back to work, that the definition of office is not going to be the same anymore. And there are going to be a lot more jobs that are considered to be telework and remotely available. So I do believe that the key to that is the ability to scale and the ability to work in a secure environment at scale. And given the thoughts that you just gave us on portability and flexibility, I know I was speaking with Jason Gray the other day, and he said, basically, we'd like it to be agnostic. We'd like to be able to move work packages. And, that could be the wave of the future. So thank you for your comments. Mark, same question for you. What are you seeing in the conversations you're having with your clients, and what's the best advice you're giving them? And what are some of the unique things you see government doing with cloud?
Yeah, thanks, Margie. I think it's been great so far from the keynote to the speakers here. I think one of the things that's changed in the last several years I've been doing that is the definition of why cloud. I used to go in and say, why cloud? And they said, well, because my CIO told me I had to. Now it's gotten much more sophisticated around the various workloads. Which workloads makes more sense? Which workloads can be brought to different types of clouds? Back to the hybrid discussion. It's a rationalization of workloads like we talked about earlier, right? Dan was talking about this. What makes the most sense where? And I really liked what Dan said about leveraging the work that's been done before. I think that's something we're not seeing enough of in government, and my advice to them would be this is, FedRAMP was built to take away the restrictions like Dan was talking about. How do you make the tick easier? I still see a lot of what I would call, for lack of any other term, the FISMA mentality, in that my folks have to look at this. We have to do checking all these. Whereas FedRAMP is supposed to be like, it's been checked, it's been another agency, or it's been the JAB. They have provided all the paperwork for you. You don't have to go back and do this work. 4 things that have already been done. Like Dan was saying, leverage what other people have done. But there will always be new workloads too. Mahtab gave a great story about, hey, you have to jump into something because of COVID-19. You need to experiment with new things. Even if it's not COVID, there will always be this desire to learn more. So it goes back to what Grant was saying about security of data. It's about securing the data. So think about, if I just take a subset of my data and I mask it and it no longer means anything, can I go experiment with different clouds safely? Absolutely. I think that's a mentality that I'm seeing in some customers, but not enough to go out and learn what new innovation is there, because there are always and always will be new creation of new services and technologies that can mean a lot to government and its constituents. So take data that doesn't matter to anyone, that's been masked, it's real valid data, and go experiment with some of these new things before you need to go through all the workload of doing an ATO. Then once you know how you would use that service and what you would use it for, then you can say, okay, this doesn't exist anymore, but it's good for my agency. We're going to do this. And now I put my people to that effort, which is more valuable. And once it gets done, of course, everyone else can leverage it and see the value of what you've done. So that's the kind of discussions I'm having with customers now, and some of the advice I'm giving them on ways to look at new services and use this hybrid environment of bring the workload to the right place at the right time.
Well, thanks, Mark. I think one of the thoughts that you brought forward was the innovation and the ability to take a risk and pursue those experiments, and being able to work at the data layer, because working at the data layer is going to be the key to security and more open environments as we go forward. And, you know, I would say today, a lot of your data is out there. And you need to be able to understand that if we can encrypt and work at the data layer and monitor what is going on with that data, we're going to be much better off. These environments are no longer castle and moat, multi-layer, secured. It's more software-defined networks. It's more, you know, internet as transport. So we're going to be operating in those environments as we go into the future. And one of the discussions that we're having today is how we're going to secure it. That's going to be very tricky, but in actuality, it's going to be forced upon us because we're going to have to operate that way. So we need to figure out what the true answers are at this point and then move out very smartly. So I have a next set of questions for all the panelists. In creating these cloud environments, you know it's never easy to do this transition. So what have you observed as the key factors to success, or the cautionary tales, sort of the do's or don'ts? And we'll start with Brian.
Yeah, so there's quite a few of those. Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, I mean, part of the challenge is really making sure that all the people involved understand the fundamental differences in the mechanics of how these environments work. And even between different clouds, you know, SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS all function very differently, and even different providers within those operate very differently. There's only a couple of cloud solutions that operate fairly closely to their legacy counterparts, so it's very rare. We see this as a huge issue when we engage with a lot of our business customers in terms of making sure they fully understand the implications of how these things work, so they can take advantage of the functionality and the possibilities in the systems, but then also realize what changes need to be made, you know, to the application layer itself and the data layer. It really, I can't underscore that enough. Going to eyes wide open is critical. Also, quite frankly, there has to be, especially at the SaaS and PaaS layer, when you're talking about applications, there has to be room to update the processes and the way the business units actually operate. What we see is oftentimes folks want to come in and just lift and shift their existing processes and make it look exactly like what they had before, but different. And, you know, part of the value in these tools is you're buying a lot of that already baked into the code. So you're really just configuring it. They end up spending a lot of time, sometimes choosing the wrong tool and then trying to back into that change averse stance, if you will. And you really lose the benefit. You increase the cost of customization and the challenge in stabilizing security in that environment if you over customize a SaaS or a PaaS offering. Really critical to do that. Also, you know, quite frankly, what we found is that security operates oftentimes in a much more granular, optimal way in the cloud versus what we can ever do on-prem. The amount of research and development that goes into this on the cloud providers' behalfs, we could never match that with our traditional security resources that we have in our network-centric models. So that's something that you also have to understand how the security piece works, and making sure you have a good strategy for authentication and role-based access is crucial. You know, we've moved toward, and started the movement very quickly into a cloud-based authentication tool that will provide a single layer of authentication across both our internal and external customers. One thing that we've noticed was a real discriminator in terms of our business units' choices to go into the cloud was the ease of providing resources to our external partners and external user community that access our data for specific mission-related business needs. As you can imagine, trying to do that in a traditional network environment just really isn't feasible. So knowing really who that user base is that you're targeting with your application layer work is critical to make sure that you've got those controls built in. And you've got the right approach in terms of who is going to say, yes, it's okay for this individual to have access to that environment, and what level of rigor are you going to put into that process. And then certainly as you kind of work back into the layers of detail, you also want to think about what data is going to be used in this from the standpoint of data becoming really truly an asset. So once I've captured this data or I have residual data downstream from a workflow process, what are the other uses that might come from this data, and start connecting the dots with other business data consumers to see how we can actually look at reusing that data, sharing that data, not just for analytics, but also to avoid duplicate data entry, and to make sure that we avoid things like reconciliation errors between different data sets and whatnot. So that there are a lot of second and third order effects that become possible when you leave that traditional kind of, line and box model of a system and data set, and start looking at how the different pieces of cloud-based application services kind of connect together and allow you to more seamlessly share data between those activities. So, those are just some of the main things, but even at a larger level, cannot underestimate the amount of change management that you really need to think about through the entire process. And not just from the user perspective. I mean, certainly when you're talking about collaboration tools and SaaS stuff, there's a degree of that, but what you got to think about how this changes your contracting models. Your contracting folks need to understand it. Budget folks, as you move to a consumption-based cost model for services, government doesn't budget that way. So you have to have very good kind of tactics around how to manage that. Need to think about how the back-end environments need to change, and making sure the networking security professionals understand in depth, what you're trying to do, because this whole thing triggers a lot of second order effects. So when we talk about things like, say, a hybrid data share between, say, a SaaS tool and an on-prem or a private cloud data set, well, there's a whole host of changes that need to be enabled at the network level and the security level to make that work safely and repeatably. And so thinking through those processes and getting those stakeholders comfortable with the change is really critical, or you will have just made this great solution that now you can't access the data to run it. And with that, it drives a lot of downstream policy changes, and certainly you have to be open to adjusting risk tolerance also, certainly more senior levels, because that's going to drive a lot of, you have that interplay of, hey, I can do all this great stuff really, really fast. Because like in that, some of the examples I was talking about, we rolled out 10 applications in 2 weeks that service the whole department. That's never been done before like that, at that kind of scale and speed. And the cloud made that possible, but it wouldn't have been possible without having the right stakeholders in place, understanding risk tolerance and making adjustments based on exigent circumstances, knowing your security and how to empower that, and really understanding what the priorities were for the organization. All those other things you have to be brought into this discussion as you start talking about modernization and taking advantage of these capabilities, kind of drive you into a change management paradigm. I think the key though is to look at it as trying to get to not getting to where you're done changing, but getting to where you're done making big changes and you make small changes all the time. And that just makes it a lot easier. You really have to change that change paradigm, if you will.
Right. The incremental approach always seems to give you a little bit of the try something, if it fails, fail fast, and then move forward. The emphasis on understanding your data and your current architecture and knowing how those interact together and being able to address each one of those in turn and understand how you mesh them in order to go to the next set of technologies is critical. And finally, I really liked your comment about the fact that you have to rethink the way that you actually deliver your mission processes. And you don't form fit it to the technology or try to customize the technology to fit it. You really have to rethink the way that you deliver your services, and then understand how you would apply the technologies to it. So, Dan, you want to add to that?
Sure. It's a tough act to follow. Thank you for inviting Brian. So now it's very difficult for me to make anything interesting anymore.
That's okay. You can just riff off of that, and then you can make it a little shorter. That's fine.
So, sounds great. Well, the Centers of Excellence have been fortunate to work with nearly a dozen federal agencies. I've personally been on 4 engagements. And what I've seen is that what works at one agency doesn't necessarily work at another. It can be shot down in a second. So let me just start with what I personally believe is probably the single most important success factor in cloud transition. And I'll say it very slowly: strong executive leadership. Strong leaders empower their organizations to make credible, risk-informed decisions, which drives business outcomes. Forward-leaning CIOs like Maria Rowe and Dave Shive, they're known for a reason. They're masters at the things of like what Brian was talking about, the fail fast, fail forward. Strong leaders tend to have a plan. They have it documented, they have it communicated, and most importantly, they've had it picked apart by their business units. This, of course, means things like business case and alternatives analyses. It also means that they have a dogged commitment to modernization. I mean, look, Margie, as you know, this is hard work. It takes a lot of resolve to see these types of things done. So I want to amplify, again, what Brian said previously. Successful executives understand that success is an eyes wide open exercise. They prepare the battle space and then they execute with excellence. And one last consideration, and I'll wrap this up. In large agencies, a centralized cloud management office located under the CIO can be a force multiplier for adoption. Consider some of these ideas, and these might be experiences that I've actually seen. Being located under the CIO, there's a close integration with the C-suite. So adoption of large-scale solutions, for example, AI ML solutions, which are really more data than code, they're more easily facilitated because they're handled at the C-suite, vice trying to matriculate upwards. FITARA requirements, much more easily satisfied with a centralized environment. Security can be integrated as an organizational imperative, vice a patchwork of independent capability-specific tools. Does any of this sound familiar? I've lived this life.
I think so.
Right. Centralized control of enterprise IT assets is almost always easier, and cloud solutions are no different. For instance, if we take a look at the rapid embrace of DevSecOps and AI/ML ops pipeline solutions, these things are driving innovation across the federal space. They're all cloud-based, right? The Centers of Excellence has helped 2 organizations so far work through what a centralized DevSecOps as a service and an AI/ML ops as a service for their own organizations would look like. It's this kind of forward thinking that can enable the entire organization to develop secure, innovative solutions rapidly and immediately experience value. I think this is part of the TCO conversation that we had earlier. So I think one, the strong leadership drives the other, which is this idea that because we have a clear understanding of what we have on the ground, we understand our brick and mortar. Now we're going to start moving some of this stuff into the cloud, and many of our new solutions are going to be cloud-based. We're going to start building our applications through DevSecOps and AI/ML ops pipelines in the cloud space. Strong leadership with this centralized, unified control really helps. There are some downsides, and I don't want to get too far into it, take up a bunch of time, but for large organizations, that's a very strong value proposition, I think. Thanks.
Yeah. So the buy-in and the leadership carrying the flag and understanding what modernization can mean to the mission, understanding the art of the possible, and then supporting both the mission leaders and the technologists to be able to actually deliver on that promise is absolutely critical. I know Brian talked about change management. It's usually not the technology, it's usually the human beings. And we have to understand that that's a huge part of the equation. You've seen it in COVID-19 and the way we flipped the switch very quickly and people adapted. There are some that adapted better than others. And that cultural change occurred because it was necessity. And we had to do it overnight. So those are the kinds of things that are driven by the mission imperative. And when you see these kinds of big moves to the cloud, you can absolutely count on some cultural divides occurring, but eventually people recognize the value and being able to move forward. So I'd like to ask Mark to add anything further.
Yeah, thanks, Margie. I liked what you said about the cultural change and the rapid cultural change. We can do it when we need to, but it comes back to what Dan was talking about as far as risk informed. It can't be risk avoidance. You know, if you want to be successful with this transition, you make at the appropriate level the right risk decisions. And a lot of times the appropriate level, it's not always, you know, the head of the agency. It can't always be, right? As Brian was talking about, there's different integration requirements, networking, security requirements. Everyone on the team needs to have this mindset of, how are we going to make this happen? Not like, why can we not make this happen? You know, it's like when it happened overnight, like you were just talking about, Margie, everybody leaned into it, and guess what? It got done in most cases. Yeah. You know, so that's the, I can do it. I got to figure out how I'm going to do it securely and reliably, versus the, oh no, you know, hang on, this is, you know, too much risk. I can't do this. So take the right risk from the top down, drive that mentality. That's a good, strong, you know, success factor for these transitions. Big don't, I would say, is not, you know, to try to think I'm just going to take what I have and move into the cloud. Again, back to what Brian was saying, I'm going to make this fit my processes. Nothing's going to change here. You know, sometimes there are better ways of doing things. You know, we need to adopt those and think about that as we look at where we're going to go. And sometimes we have customized what we have so much that it works. It works specifically for the needs of government because they're unique to anything else in the world. And so, okay, maybe we can find a better, more efficient way to do that. But sometimes it's also, especially back office, HR, financials, move to a SaaS product, you know, change those products, go to something SaaS, and then move the really core mission things to an infrastructure. And you're looking for a way to connect all those, again, back to the hybrid cloud kind of story. So, you know, the don't is, don't just move what you've got.
Exactly. There's such a huge opportunity to be able to completely reimagine the services and to have those enabled by technology. And people have to be visionary enough to do that. And that's where the leadership comes in. And then everybody just lines up in sequence and has their particular role to play. So Mahtab, you want to add some last thoughts on this one?
Sure. Again, I agree with everything that the rest of the panelists have said. I'll add a few things to it. Some do's and don'ts. And I think that I'm in a very unique position because I get to see across many agencies, and I can also see internally at what Dell did in moving to the cloud and what worked and what didn't. So I'll start with a few don'ts. Don't patch up your legacy on-prem data center and try to turn that into a private cloud. You really can't take the stuff that you have and turn it into the stuff that you want. I see customers trying to do that by adding automation to their legacy on-prem, and really all you're doing is automating the problem. So that's a big don't. Another big don't. Don't really rely on SaaS for everything. I think that a lot of our agencies are starting with SaaS as their first option, but there comes a point where if you are having to customize that SaaS tool over 20% to meet the requirements, it's probably not the right fit. So I think that we really need to be intentional about when we use SaaS versus other cloud technologies. My last don't, again, don't think about cloud as a place. It's an operating model, and you really need to make sure that you have options and make sure you know that even in a private cloud, there are so many different cost modelings that OEMs can provide, you know, flexible, consumption-based, subscription-based. Partners like Vion in the ecosystem have done this for a long time. You can do OpEx with private clouds. You just have to write, you know, the right contracts, and you can do managed service with a private cloud. Those all exist. Some do's. I think application rationalization is amazing. I think one other way to look at it is leverage events such as an ELA renewal or the requirement for a net new application or an application going end of support life or needing an upgrade as a catalyst to move and change it and go to the right cloud solution. And when those events happen, you really need to kind of identify 6 different branches of that workload. You look at it from a workload perspective. And again, you either decide to repurchase it, and that's a SaaS capability. You rewrite it, a PaaS capability, re-platform it, containerize strategy, rehost it, which is IaaS, you retain it, IaaS, or you retire it. And I think that what IT needs to be really good at is catching those 6 branches and determining the right landing zone for it, whether it be SaaS, private, public, hybrid. And just think of 2 questions, where do I run work? Where do I store data? And when you really go through that, again, does the data live on a Navy ship? Is it mobile? Is it at your edge? You'll start to really land on the appropriate landing zone. So IT has to be smart about catching those 6 R's, or we call them branches. And you really know when it's working in a customer when you stop seeing sole source AWS contracts and you start seeing more IDIQs for IaaS that have both public and private, awardees on it that give you options so that you're not, just limited to a single solution.
So we keep coming back to the theme of the flexibility, the portability, and also understanding your own roadmap and how you want your mission to evolve as it's enabled by technology. Choosing the right, even portfolios of systems. I know when I was at DHS, there were several systems that worked together and included systems that were at the State Department and DOJ, where they worked together in common business practices, and understanding how that operates and then being able to modernize accordingly for the entirety of the end-to-end business process is important. And it's not one size fits all. Some of it will be in public cloud, some of it will be on-prem, some of it the data will be one place and we'll have to operate between the 2. And that really leads us to our last question. And we may have covered some of this territory already, so it'll probably be, a little bit shorter discussion than we originally anticipated because we've talked about a couple of the complexities. But, as federal agencies operate in these multi-cloud environments, the ecosystems do become more complex. They're harder to manage, both from an operations and a security point of view. So how have your agencies or your clients managed that complexity? So things like cloud orchestration or things of that nature, what are the best practices that you've observed? And, Mahtab, since we're with you, we'll start with you.
Yeah, and again, just going back to the last question, the customers that I have to give shout outs to are Stuart McGuigan at State Department and EAD Rich Haley at FBI. They're putting all these things into action. So I just wanted to make sure I included that. To answer your question, I really have to go back to my initial remarks. You really have to look at standardized cloud agnostic solutions. I'll give you an example. Pretty self-serving for me, but there are others. Here at Dell, we provide the Dell Technologies cloud, and we have that with an on-prem solution, but we have that exact same solution and software stack in AWS, in Azure, Google, and Oracle is going to be GA here, Mark, I think, in the next couple quarters. And what that allows our customers to do is have a multi-cloud ecosystem, but have standardized services, be able to have ops teams that are standardized on similar technologies. And that really eliminates the need to have an AWS ops team, a Google ops team, an Azure ops team, a private cloud ops team. As much as you can standardize and leverage cloud agnostic services, I think that really brings the complexity down.
Mark, can you add?
Sorry, stuck on mute there for a second. So I do think that one of the ways, I agree that, it's try to standardize on particular operating models, but I also think the biggest way probably to hand off complexity is to go to a SaaS model, right? Where you've handed all the complexity of managing the application the data, the infrastructure, everything to the cloud provider. It can greatly simplify everything, including even much of the security, right? There's still always going to be things for the end users to do, but that's going to be the most simple operating model you can have. And then as you scale down gracefully from there, depending on what the workload is, like we talked about before, you try to kind of give away as much complexity as you can and only keep things when you have to actually operate that portion of it. For security, I think it all comes down to data is at the core, right? We've talked about that, and it's talking about choosing a cloud that's got encryption all the way across, so that even if you're breached, your data is encrypted. Then you have the infrastructure is secured. Then you move out to the application and eventually the users, and you have security built in at all the layers, because it's no longer like you were saying, Margie. It's not just a fortress out there. We just keep people out. The assumption has to be that there's a zero trust environment. Which is the way modern Gen 2 clouds are built. It's what Oracle has built for their, our cloud and how we provide it to customers. So that's the way we think of security.
Dan?
Hey, so from an operations perspective, I mentioned in the last question that centralized cloud management is, or can be at least, a force multiplier. Let me riff on that a little bit based on some of the things that I just heard from Mahtab and Mark, who frankly articulated it much better than I could. So centralized approaches to multi-cloud environments are optimal, right? Because they provide that standardization that Mahtab was talking about. And also, as Mark mentioned, if they decide that one of the ways to reduce that complexity is to simply give it away and move with a SaaS model, it's that centralized ability. It's the C-suite that makes those decisions so they can do that. But if they decide to keep some of those, all right, a centralized approach is easier from a product or easy to produce relevant governance, right? So all the governance, the strong governance we were talking about earlier, is provided by, embedded by the C-suite. So say, for instance, a simple question, is the data security lake, which is owned by the CISO, or is it owned by the CDO? It seems like a simple question, but it's not really a simple answer, especially when you start getting into it. And where are those answers written? What governance specifically addresses security products like Zero Trust that has capabilities which are amplified by using what's traditionally considered non-security data? One of the elements of a very mature Zero Trust implementation is using some HR data to understand where our folks are coming from and what they're doing. So that data does not live in a data security lake. It might live in a data lake, but it's not the data security lake. And the CISO does not own that. So where does that integration come into? That's where centralization comes into play. It's also easier to effect and ensure proper oversight. For instance, multiple business lines using the same forms. This might have actually happened in the federal government once or twice. Multiple business lines within one agency use the exact same forms to accomplish different things. Different lines of business were doing it. And they weren't sharing. In fact, they didn't even know that they were doing it. So how much longer would it take to herd those kittens versus a single executive with budgetary authority, say for instance, maybe a COO, making a strategic decision to consolidate those two lines of effort? And the acquisition piece that Mahtab was talking about earlier, centralization helps ensure the most efficient use of funds. It becomes a business decision. It's not just a security decision. It's not just a data decision. It's a business decision, right? And lastly, I'll just wrap up this piece with a word of caution. It's not all roses out there, right? Centralized approach is great for small and medium-sized organizations, but there is danger in large organizations. It can make business units less accountable. For example, I might have been in an organization at one point in history that had what we would call a 1.0 implementation that saw all their business units thrown into a centralized bucket. And it seemed like that was the way to go. We only have one bill, we only have one this and one that. And it wasn't a problem until one misconfigured process single-handedly burned 26% of the annual dev budget in one weekend. Then all of a sudden it became an organizationally wide major impact. So 2.0 leverages, or like the Cloud 2.0 and the evolution of our management products, allow us better software, better solutions. Vendors are doing a fantastic job, but the question I would bring is, management software is not the sole solution. It has to be combined with a solid governance model, billing integration, and other things, considerations, in order to reduce some of the problems in large-scale organizations. It's not just simply, hey, this is web scale, let's go with it and move forward, until, again, you burn 26% of your dev budget because of one rogue process, no value added.
Yeah. So Brian, if you could bring us home, and then we'll move to questions with Megan.
Yeah, so kind of going to that centralization, decentralization, what should you do? Yes. So the way we've addressed it really with our entire strategy is to say, look, we want to provide centrally managed platforms and access to those. But in terms of satisfying your business need, that needs to be managed at the location closer to where those business decisions are being made. So if there are back office processes that are managed back at headquarters, the headquarters should be deciding that. If there are management processes that are basically decision powers in the field, they need the power to decide that. And so we're trying to align our technology approach with that. So that way we don't have to try to manage change over 30 different bureaus trying to use the same tool to do kind of the same thing but different. Instead, we're saying, look, why don't you come on our platform? We'll take care of all the nitty-gritty IT stuff. You focus on your business process, your configuration, your user community, talking to your customers, and making sure you're meeting your business objectives. And oh, by the way, if you can do that in our SaaS platform and our boundary, you're not going to need an ATO because it'll be covered within ours. And so we're really trying to take a smarter look to how we kind of make those divisions based on decision points, and not so much just a technology back end. To that earlier point quickly about automation, yes, automation is critical and it's key. It really doesn't work optimally in terms of, one pane of glass on everything. There are still native tool pieces that happen better in those distinct environments. That being said, there are other things that you can aggregate, like security monitoring, CASB activity, certainly access controls. But some of the nitty-gritty things like orchestration need to happen in organic tool sets, native tool sets. It really just depends on what it is. And that's something we're continuing to mature as we go down the journey. And I think industry will continue to come up with better solutions to optimize that environment. But automation is critical in making sure you have good delivery.
Thank you. And Megan, I think you probably have been monitoring the universe there and seeing if there are any questions that could be asked.
Yeah, I think there was one good question that came up from the audience, and I don't know that all the panelists need to address it since we're getting a little bit tight on time, but the question is, there's been discussion about how agencies are moving systems and workloads from on-premise to cloud environments, and what kind of special considerations should be given as agencies, launch these new mission services or new capabilities on cloud platforms. There's a couple thoughts on that. That would be great.
Okay, can someone volunteer? Okay, Dan?
Application rationalization. What is that capability, and does it really need to go? Do you really need to have it? And does someone else actually do it better?
That's a nice, short, succinct answer. I like that. So Margie, you guys have just a couple minutes left, so I'll leave it to you to wrap it up then.
Okay, well, thank you to our panelists today. Let's do a real round robin, just quick, 30 seconds. What would you like the takeaway to be for the audience today? And Dan, since you were up, we'll start with you.
Okay, 30 seconds. 3 key areas for successful cloud adoption. 1, remove the barriers to the adoption itself. 2, accelerate risk determinations. And 3, increase the efficiency. That is, lower the TCO while increasing service delivery. I think there's governance that supports most of that. Seek that governance, and I think you'll be well on your way.
Great. Brian?
I'd say understand the culture you're working in. Definitely understand the problems that your customers are trying to solve, and make sure they understand the art of the possible as well. And thread that needle between the art of the possible and the constraints that you have to try to marry that to an optimal solution going forward. And I think that's going to be one of the key things, that you cannot underestimate the impact of culture and people on adoption of technology.
Mark?
Yeah, to Brian's point, it's all about getting people to say, tell me how. use the right level of risk. Tell me how we're going to do this, because we're going to do it. Don't tell me no. Leverage what's been done before. Take the FedRAMP solutions, use what people have done. And don't be afraid to, experiment with new stuff. Kind of to the last question, go use new services, stand up new capabilities in cloud with dummy data, so that you can experiment and determine how does it apply to my agency. And that's a valuable way to get started.
And Mahtab, final thought.
Try to be really quick. I would say don't over rotate on anything. Like, just make sure that you have options. I think a lot of our customers are over rotating on SaaS, and if we're all using ServiceNow or Salesforce for everything, what's the difference between different organizations? I would also say that in order to be cloud smart, you have to, again, app rationalize, or we call it, look at the workloads from those 6 branches. And after that, it comes down to 2 questions. Where do I want work, and where do I store data? And lastly, I go back to it, leverage the innovation, not the technology. Don't get locked into proprietary technology unless it's unique and differentiated, and leverage agnostic services and layer them across your ecosystem for mobility and easier operations.
Thank you so much to our panelists today. And Megan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, thanks again to our panel. And thanks to you, Margie. It was great having you here today, and hope you can maybe stay for the rest of the conversation.